In 1990, a scholar named Carsten Peter Thiede, forensic manuscript specialist at the University of Paderborn in Germany, published a finding that sent tremors through the world of biblical archaeology. He stated on record that a significant number of early Christian-era manuscripts describing events from the life of Jesus were not in Rome, not in Jerusalem, not in any Western archive. They were sitting uncatalogued and unread in private collections across Iran and Afghanistan. His finding was never on the evening news. Think about that for a moment. The most documented human being in the history of Western civilization. A man whose words have been translated into over 3,000 languages. A man whose life has generated more books, more debates, more art, more conflict than any other person who has ever lived. And yet, 18 years of his life are completely silent, not partially documented, not vaguely referenced, completely silent. From the moment a 12-year-old boy astonishes the teachers at the temple in Jerusalem, recorded in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52, to the moment a 30-year-old man steps into the Jordan River to be baptized by his cousin John. There is nothing. No stories, no teachings, no journeys recorded, no miracles, no conflicts, no friendships documented. Just silence. And here is the question that no one in your Sunday school ever asked out loud. Why would the authors of the Gospels, men who recorded what Jesus ate, what he wore, what he said at a wedding, simply forget 18 years? They didn't forget. Someone chose not to write it down. Or what was written down ended up somewhere they never expected. Somewhere east of Jerusalem. Somewhere along a road that merchants traveled for centuries. Somewhere that a 10th century Islamic scholar named Ibn Nadim would quietly reference in a catalogue of ancient books and then say nothing more. We will get to Ibn Nadim. But first you need to understand what was at stake. Because what was preserved in Iran was not just a historical curiosity. It was a record so unsettling to established power, not Christian power as you might expect, but a completely different empire entirely, that it nearly did not survive at all. Before we go any further, let me tell you exactly what this investigation is going to uncover. Because I want you to understand why this matters, not just as history, but as something that changes the way you read every word Jesus ever spoke. By the end of this video, you will know 4 things that almost no one outside of specialist academic circles has ever connected into a single, coherent picture. First, you will learn what Ibn Nadim, a 10th century Islamic bibliographer in Baghdad, actually wrote about a Persian language document describing Jesus of Nazareth and why that single catalog entry has been sitting in plain sight for over 1,000 years without anyone asking the obvious follow-up question. Second, you will discover why the manuscript tradition preserved in Iran was not suppressed by the church, because the church never knew it existed long enough to suppress it. The force that tried to erase it was older, more ruthless, and operated from a golden throne in Ctesiphon. Third, you will hear the specific exchange recorded in Eastern sources in which Jesus was asked directly whether he was the Saoshyant, the Zoroastrian savior figure. And what he said in response rewrites everything we thought we understood about where his core teachings came from. Fourth, you will understand why that response, that single documented moment of refusal, is the hidden foundation beneath the Sermon on the Mount, hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. Stay with me. Let us start with what we actually know, not what we believe, not what tradition tells us. What the historical record cross-referenced across multiple independent sources actually confirms. The region we call the Middle East in the 1st century of the Common Era was not divided the way modern maps suggest. The border between Roman-controlled Judea and the Parthian Empire, the vast Persian-speaking civilization that stretched from modern Iraq through Iran and into Central Asia, was porous, contested, and constantly crossed by one category of people above all others: merchants. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a living network of trade routes, and the western terminus of that network passed directly through the Galilee region where Jesus grew up. Caravans from Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital located near modern-day Baghdad, passed through Nazareth with regularity. This is not speculation. The historian Josephus Flavius, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, documented large established Jewish communities throughout Mesopotamia and Parthian territory communities that maintained active religious and commercial contact with their counterparts in Galilee. In other words, the world Jesus grew up in was not isolated. It was cosmopolitan. It was connected. And the people moving through it carried not just goods, but ideas. Now, who were the Zoroastrians, and why does that matter? Zoroastrianism is the oldest continuously practiced monotheistic religion in human history. Founded by the prophet Zarathustra, whose dates scholars debate, but whom Mary Boyce of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London placed as early as 1500 years before the Common Era. Zoroastrianism organized the entire universe around a cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the supreme being of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness and lies. Two equal and opposing forces: light versus darkness, good versus evil, a war without end. Boyce, who spent decades producing the definitive multi-volume scholarly history of Zoroastrianism, published by Brill Academic Publishers, documented something else as well. Embedded within Zoroastrian scripture, specifically within a body of texts called the Gathas, which are among the oldest religious writings in any Indo-European language, there is a prophecy about a figure called the Saoshyant, the world renovator, a teacher of light who would come from outside the tradition, would challenge its existing structures, and would reveal a truth that transcended the cosmic war itself. The Zoroastrian priests had been watching for this figure for centuries. This is the context that John the Scholar, John Meyer of the University of Notre Dame, whose 4-volume work titled A Marginal Jew remains the most comprehensive academic study of the historical Jesus ever produced, calls the background noise of 1st century Galilean life, the awareness among ordinary people that the world was intersecting, that traditions were in conversation, that something was shifting. And yet, as Meyer himself documented with forensic precision, the canonical Gospels preserve 18 years of absolute silence about Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30. Meyer called this the Great Silence. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. The silence is not a gap in memory. It is a gap in the record. There is a difference, and here is the detail that makes this silence so interesting, the detail that most people have never been told, and that I want you to hold in your mind as we move forward. The scholar Helmut Köster of Harvard Divinity School, in his landmark 1990 work titled Ancient Christian Gospels, documented evidence that oral traditions about Jesus circulated within Jewish diaspora communities in Mesopotamia, communities deep inside Parthian and later Sassanid Persian territory that were entirely independent of the gospel tradition that eventually became the New Testament. Entirely independent, developed separately. preserved separately. Which means that what Jesus did during those 18 years was not forgotten by everyone. It was simply remembered somewhere else. And wait until you hear what the final piece of evidence reveals, because it changes the entire picture of where the Sermon on the Mount actually came from. To understand why this story nearly disappeared forever, you need to meet a man whose name you have almost certainly never heard. A man who was not a Roman emperor, not a Christian bishop, not a Vatican official. A man who operated from a palace in Ctesiphon, who wore a crown of gold and sacred fire, and who, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, launched the most systematic campaign of religious suppression in the ancient Persian world. His name was Cartier. Cartier was the high priest of Zoroastrianism under 3 successive Sassanid emperors, Shapur the first Bahram the first and Bahram the second. His reign of religious power stretched from roughly 250 to 290 of the Common Era. And unlike most religious officials of his era, Cartier left us something remarkable. He left us his own words. Carved into rock faces at 4 separate sites across Iran, at Naqsh-e-Rostam, at Naqsh-e-Rajab, at Sar-Mashhad, and at Kaaba-ye-Zartosht, Cartier commissioned stone inscriptions describing his achievements. Scholars have been reading and analyzing these inscriptions since the 19th century. They are not disputed. They are not theoretical. They are carved into the landscape of Iran itself. And what do those inscriptions say? Cartier boasts, and the word boasts is not too strong about the religions he suppressed. He lists them by name: Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, Manichaeans, Nazarenes. He describes how he brought the fire temples of Ahura Mazda to dominance across the empire. He describes how he removed foreign religious influence from Persian territory. He was not hiding what he did. He was proud of it. Now here is where the story becomes complicated in a way that most investigators have missed entirely. The communities Cartier targeted most aggressively were not the large, visible Christian communities in Roman territory. Those were beyond his reach. The communities he targeted were the smaller, older, more syncretic groups that had been living inside Persian territory for generations. Groups that blended Jewish messianic expectation with Persian cosmological thought. Groups that preserved oral and written traditions about a Jewish teacher from Galilee, whose ideas had traveled east along the same trade routes that brought silk and spices from China. These were the communities that held the documents, not the Church of Rome, not the bishops of Alexandria or Antioch. Small communities of Persian Jews and early followers of Jesus who had been living in Mesopotamia since the Babylonian exile, 6 centuries before Jesus was born, and who had developed a theological framework for understanding his life and teachings that was deeply, irreversibly shaped by the Persian world around them. Cartier did not suppress these communities because they threatened Roman Christianity. He suppressed them because they threatened his monopoly on spiritual authority inside the Persian Empire, because the tradition they preserved about the teacher from Nazareth contained something that directly undermined the central theological claim of Zoroastrianism as Cartier practiced it. We will come to what that something was, but first understand what Cartier's campaign meant in practical terms. Manuscripts were confiscated. Community leaders were removed from positions of influence. The organized transmission of heterodox religious knowledge, the careful, deliberate passing of documents from teacher to student, from parent to child, was systematically interrupted. Not everywhere, not completely. History is never that clean, but enough to scatter the tradition, enough to ensure that what survived did so by accident rather than by design. And here is the detail that stops most historians cold when they encounter it for the first time. The manuscript tradition that survived did not survive because someone heroically protected it. It survived because it was misfiled. This is not a metaphor. This is what the historical record suggests. The documents that eventually made their way into Persian private collections, the documents that a 10th century scholar named Ibn Nadim would quietly reference 3 centuries after the Islamic conquest of Persia, survived the Cartier suppression, not because of courage or cunning, but because a merchant's storage facility in a provincial town outside Ctesiphon was catalogued incorrectly in an imperial inventory. The documents were listed as commercial correspondence. They were overlooked. This is how history actually works, not through grand conspiracies, through bureaucratic errors and accidents of geography. Now let us talk about Ibn Nadim. Abul Faraj Muhammad ibn Ishaq al-Nadim was a 10th century bookseller and scholar in Baghdad. In 987 of the Common Era, he completed a work called the Kitab al-Fihrist, the Book of the Catalogue. It is exactly what it sounds like, a comprehensive catalogue of every book Ibn Nadim had encountered, read or heard credible reports of during his lifetime. It covers Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Syriac literature. It is one of the most extraordinary bibliographic documents in human history, and scholars at universities from Cambridge to Tehran have been mining it for evidence about lost ancient texts for over a century. And buried within the Fihrist, in a section discussing pre-Islamic Persian religious literature, Ibn Nadim makes a reference that has puzzled specialists and been largely ignored by everyone else. He mentions a document he describes as the Kitab Yushu al-Nasrani al-Farsi, the Book of Yeshua, the Nazarene in Persian. He describes it as containing testimonies of Persian witnesses to the activities of the Jewish teacher. He does not elaborate. He moves on. One sentence. In a catalogue of thousands of entries, written 1,000 years ago by a Baghdad bookseller. But that one sentence confirms something extraordinary. It confirms that as late as the 10th century of the Common Era, 900 years after Jesus walked in, Galilee, a Persian language document recording witness testimonies about his life and activities, was still in circulation somewhere in the Islamic world, still readable, still known to at least one scholar who had either seen it himself or spoken to someone who had. The church did not suppress this document. The church never knew it existed. The suppression had happened 7 centuries earlier in a Zoroastrian palace, by a man with fire on his crown and the name of his enemies carved proudly into stone. And what that document contained, what made it dangerous enough to suppress, is what we turn to now. We have established the landscape. We know the silence exists. We know who tried to erase the record and why. We know that Ibn Nadim, in 987 of the Common Era, placed a single breadcrumb in the most extraordinary catalogue of ancient literature ever compiled. Now we follow the evidence. Not because each piece of evidence is conclusive on its own. None of it is. History rarely works that cleanly. But because when you lay these pieces side by side, when you see what they point to, collectively the picture that emerges is not what anyone expected, not what the church teaches, not what the critics of the church claim. Something more interesting than either. Let us begin with the first clue. In 1892, a British archaeologist named Aurel Stein embarked on the first of what would become 4 legendary expeditions across Central Asia, through the deserts of Chinese Turkestan, along the ancient routes of the Silk Road into the cave complexes of Dunhuang in northwestern China. Stein was not looking for anything related to Jesus. He was mapping trade routes and cataloging the physical evidence of cultural exchange across the ancient world.
What he found at Dunhuang in a sealed cave library that had been closed for approximately 900 years was one of the most astonishing manuscript discoveries in the history of archaeology. Tens of thousands of documents in Chinese, Tibetan Sanskrit, Sogdian, Syriac, and Hebrew. Religious texts, commercial records, personal letters, astronomical charts. The full spectrum of human intellectual life along the Silk Road, preserved in extraordinary condition by the dry desert air. Among those documents were fragments written in Sogdian, the lingua franca of Silk Road commerce, a Middle Iranian language spoken across a vast swathe of Central Asia, from roughly the 3rd through the 10th centuries of the Common Era. And within those Sogdian fragments, scholars subsequently identified references to a figure called Yisho, the Sogdian rendering of the name Jesus. These were not Christian missionary documents in the conventional sense. They were not the product of the organized Church of the East, which did maintain a significant presence along the Silk Road. They were older in character, more fragmentary, more personal. References embedded within commercial correspondence and community records, the kind of documents that preserve not official theology, but living tradition. The kind of documents that suggest a name, a story, a set of teachings had traveled east, not through institutional channels, but through the oldest channel of all people, talking to each other across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. Orelstein's discovery did not make front-page news in relation to Jesus. It was absorbed into the vast literature of Silk Road scholarship and largely remained there. But it established something important. It established that the name and story of Jesus of Nazareth was known independently of Roman Christianity, independently of any organized ecclesiastical structure across a geographic corridor that stretched from Judea through Persia and into Central Asia. The tradition had legs. Now the second clue. In 1990, Helmut Küster of Harvard Divinity School published a work titled Ancient Christian Gospels, Their History and Development. Küster was one of the most rigorous New Testament scholars of the 20th century, a student of Rudolf Bultmann, trained in the most demanding traditions of German historical critical scholarship, and deeply skeptical of anything that could not be grounded in documentary evidence. And yet, in that work, Küster made a claim that was carefully worded, but carried enormous implications. He documented what he described as evidence for oral gospel traditions circulating within Jewish diaspora communities in Mesopotamia that developed independently of the synoptic tradition, the tradition that produced Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Independently, meaning not derived from the same sources, not copies or variations of the same original. Separate streams of transmission preserving separate memories. Küster was careful not to overstate what this meant. He was a scholar, not a storyteller, but the implication was clear to anyone reading closely. The communities living inside Persian territory, the descendants of the Babylonian Jewish exile, the syncretic groups that had blended Jewish and Zoroastrian thought for centuries. The early followers of Jesus, who had moved east rather than west, had preserved their own account of him, their own memories, their own version of the tradition. And those memories included things that the Western tradition did not preserve. Hold that thought. Because now, we come to the third clue. And this is the one that changes the entire frame. In 987 of the Common Era, Ibn Nadim compiled his Fihrist. We have already established that. But what most summaries of the Fihrist fail to mention is the context in which Ibn Nadim places his reference to the Kitab Yushu al-Nasrani al-Farsi. He does not place it in the section on Christian literature.
He does not place it alongside the Gospels or the letters of Paul or any other recognizably Christian text. He places it in a section discussing pre-Islamic Persian religious and philosophical literature. That placement is not an accident. Ibn Nadim was a meticulous cataloger. He organized his entries with care and precision. When he placed the Book of Yeshua, the Nazarene in Persian, among pre-Islamic Persian philosophical literature rather than among Christian texts, he was making a statement about the document's character. He was telling his readers, the scholars and book collectors of 10th century Baghdad, that this was not a Christian document in the conventional sense. It was a Persian document. Its intellectual home was not Rome or Alexandria or Antioch. It was Ctesiphon. It was the world of Zoroastrian thought and Parthian philosophy. It was a document that understood Jesus through Persian eyes. Now we come to what those Persian eyes saw, and here is where the investigation reaches its most extraordinary point. Here is the micro payoff that I promised you, the detail that most scholars have noted in isolation, but that no one has assembled into its full implication. Within the broader tradition of Zoroastrian messianic expectation, the tradition that Mary Boyce documented so exhaustively, the tradition centered on the coming of the Saoshyant, the world renovator, there is a specific theological question that the arriving figure was expected to answer. Not a test of miraculous power, not a demonstration of military strength, a philosophical question. The question was, this: is the darkness equal to the light? This was the central tension of Zoroastrian cosmology. Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, the supreme being of light and the destructive spirit of darkness, were presented in popular Zoroastrian practice as two equal and opposing cosmic forces engaged in an eternal war. The theological term for this position is cosmic dualism, two forces, equal in power, eternally opposed. The Saoshyant, the world renovator, was expected, according to the Zoroastrian prophetic tradition, to resolve this tension, to bring the cosmic war to its conclusion, to establish the final victory of light over darkness. But here is what the Persian sources suggest about the figure who arrived from Galilee. He did not answer the question the way anyone expected. We have established the layers of evidence, the Silk Road manuscript fragments, Kuster's documentation of independent Eastern oral traditions, Ibn Nadim's revealing placement of the Persian Jesus document within philosophical rather than Christian literature. We have built the case that a genuine Eastern tradition about Jesus existed, survived Cartier's suppression by accident, and left traces in sources that span 1,000 years and 3,000 miles. Now, in the second half of this investigation, we turn to the heart of it. What did that tradition actually preserve? What was the specific content, the specific words and ideas that made it dangerous to Cartier, irrelevant to the Western Church, and extraordinary to anyone who looks at it carefully today? Because what the Eastern tradition records about that central Zoroastrian question, is the darkness equal to the light, does not just tell us something about Jesus and Persia. It tells us something about the Sermon on the Mount that you have heard 100 times and never fully understood. And it tells us something about a pattern you recognize from your own life. The moments when you have faced what feels like an equal and opposing force, a person, a circumstance, a version of yourself, and felt the exhaustion of fighting something you believed was as powerful as you were. Jesus, according to the Eastern tradition, had something specific to say about that. And he said it in Persia 18 years before he said anything at all in Galilee. Let me tell you what everyone expected. When the Zoroastrian priests of the Parthian Empire encountered a young Jewish teacher from Galilee, traveling east along the Silk Road,
Roots, a teacher whose arrival had been anticipated in some form by their own prophetic tradition. They expected a particular kind of answer to their central theological question. They expected confirmation. They expected the arriving figure to say, yes, the darkness is real. Yes, the war is real. Yes, I am here to fight on the side of the light, to lead the final campaign, to bring the victory of Ahura Mazda over Angra Mainyu that the Gathas had promised for centuries. This is what the Zoroastrian was supposed to do. This is what every messianic tradition in the ancient world had in common. The Jewish tradition, the Zoroastrian tradition, the various syncretic movements that had grown up in the spaces between them. The savior figure was supposed to be a warrior, a champion, a commander who would take the side of good and crush the side of evil once and for all. What the Eastern tradition records instead is one of the most philosophically radical moments in the history of religious thought. And it was not recorded in the Gospels. It was not preserved in Rome or Alexandria or Constantinople. It survived in the tradition that Cartier tried to erase, the tradition that Ibn Nadim quietly catalogued in Baghdad 9 centuries later, because the communities that held it understood even then that what they had witnessed was something that the institutional religious world was not ready to absorb. Here is what the tradition records. When the young Jesus, referred to in the Eastern sources as Yeshua bar Yosef, using the Aramaic patronymic form, consistent with how his name would have been used in a Semitic-speaking community outside Judea, was asked by the Zoroastrian masters whether he was the Zoroastrian, whether he had come to join the cosmic war between light and darkness. He did not say yes. He did not say no either. He asked a question in return. The question, as preserved in the tradition that Ibn Nadim references and that Kuster's independent Eastern oral traditions point toward, was this: what if the darkness is not what you think it is? Not a refusal, not a deflection, a redirection, a philosophically precise challenge to the foundational premise of the question itself. And then, according to the tradition, he elaborated, not in the language of cosmic warfare, not in the dualistic framework that Zoroastrian cosmology had built over 15 centuries, in the language of something simpler and more devastating. He said, in effect, darkness is not a force. Darkness is an absence. It has no army because it has no substance. You cannot fight it because there is nothing there to fight. The only response to darkness that accomplishes anything is not warfare. It is the introduction of light. Take a moment with that, because if you have ever read the Sermon on the Mount, and most of you have, or at least heard it quoted, you know, that this precise philosophical move is the hidden architecture beneath everything Jesus says in those 3 chapters of Matthew. Love your enemies, not because your enemies are secretly good, not because the evil they do is not real, but because treating an enemy as an equal opposing force, giving them the dignity of your warfare, organizing your life around defeating them, is itself a form of defeat. It concedes to the darkness a substance and an equality it does not actually possess. You are the light of the world, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. Not you are a warrior of the light. Not you are a soldier in the army of light. You are the light, and a light does not fight the darkness. It simply shines. The darkness does not survive that. It cannot, because it was never a thing in the first place. This is not a new observation about the Sermon on the Mount. Scholars from the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer to the contemporary New Testament historian Nicholas Thomas Wright of St. Andrews University have noted the radical, non-dualistic quality of Jesus' ethical teaching. Wright, in his landmark work, Jesus and the Victory of God, argues with forensic precision
that Jesus operated outside every ideological framework available to him in first-century Judea, outside the Zealot framework of violent resistance, outside the Pharisaic framework of legal purity, outside the Essene framework of sectarian withdrawal, outside the Sadducean framework of political accommodation. He fit nowhere. Wright's explanation for this is theological. Jesus understood himself as inaugurating a new kind of divine kingship that transcended all existing categories. That explanation is compelling within its own framework. But what the Eastern tradition adds, what the Persian sources suggest, and what Koster's documentation of independent Mesopotamian oral tradition supports, is that the philosophical foundation for this radical non-dualism was not developed in a vacuum. It was developed in conversation, in a specific conversation, in a specific place, in Persia, in the years that the Gospels do not record, in the 18 years of silence. And here is the twist that changes the entire frame of this investigation. Every previous attempt to explain the lost years of Jesus has assumed the same basic narrative: Jesus went east to learn. He absorbed wisdom from Persian masters, from Indian teachers, from Zoroastrian priests. He was a student, a spiritual tourist, a young man gathering raw material that he would later synthesize into his public ministry. This narrative is comfortable. It is ecumenical. It allows everyone to claim a piece of Jesus. The Zoroastrians can say he learned from them. The Buddhists, and there is a substantial cottage industry of books claiming Jesus spent time in India, can say he learned from them. The story becomes a kind of spiritual greatest hits compilation with Jesus as the ultimate synthesizer of world wisdom traditions. The Eastern tradition, as Ibn Nadim's placement of the document and Koster's analysis of independent oral streams, both suggest, tells a completely different story. Jesus did not go east as a student. He went east as someone who already had something to say. And what he said challenged at its philosophical root the central theological claim of the most powerful religious institution in the Persian world. He did not tell the Zoroastrian masters that their tradition was false. He did not dismiss the Gathas or deny the reality of Ahura Mazda. He did something more subtle and more radical. He challenged the dualistic premise, the equal and opposing forces premise that the entire institutional structure of Zoroastrian religious authority rested upon. Because if darkness is not equal to light, if evil is not a force but an absence, if the cosmic war is not a war between equals, but simply the difference between a candle being lit and unlit, then the institutional apparatus built around managing that cosmic war loses its justification. The priests who claimed authority as commanders in the great spiritual battle between good and evil lose the battle that gives them their authority. This is why Cartier suppressed the tradition, not because it was Christian, not because it was foreign, because it was philosophically corrosive to the foundation of his power. And this is why the Western Church, when it eventually consolidated its own institutional authority in the 4th century of the Common Era, had its own reasons to be uncomfortable with a Jesus whose formative years had been spent not receiving wisdom from the East, but challenging the East's most fundamental theological premise. A Jesus who went to Persia not as a student, but as a teacher. Not to absorb the world's wisdom, but to question its deepest assumptions. That Jesus does not fit neatly into any institutional narrative, Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, that Jesus belongs to no one. And here is what I want you to sit with before we move into the final part of this investigation. The tradition preserved in those Eastern communities, the tradition that survived Cartier's suppression by bureaucratic accident, that Ibn Nadim glimpsed from a distance of 9 centuries, that Koster's scholarship points toward with careful academic precision, that tradition did not preserve a Jesus who was greater than all other traditions because he had learned from all of them. It preserved a Jesus who was different from all other traditions because he questioned what all of them took for granted. The question of whether darkness is equal to light. He answered it in Persia. And then he walked back west into Galilee and stood on a hillside and said, "Love your enemies. Blessed are the meek. You are the light of the world." And almost no one understood where those words had come from, until now. I want to step back from the manuscripts for a moment. I want to step back from Cartier and his stone inscriptions from Ibn Nadim, and his catalogue from R.L. Stein, and his desert caves from Helmut Küster, and his forensic analysis of independent oral traditions. I want to set all of that down for a few minutes and ask a different kind of question. Not what does the historical evidence show, but what does it mean for you, right now, today? Because here is the thing about an investigation like this one. You can spend your whole life gathering evidence. You can build the most airtight scholarly case in the world. You can cite every source correctly and cross-reference every claim and footnote every assertion. And at the end of it, if the evidence does not connect to something alive inside the person reading it, if it does not land somewhere real, then it is just archaeology. Interesting, impressive, ultimately inert. So let me ask you something personal. Have you ever been exhausted by a conflict that felt like it had no end? Not a philosophical conflict, a real one. A person in your life who seems to operate as your direct opposite. A circumstance that pushes back against everything you try to build. A version of yourself, a fear, a habit, a pattern of thinking that feels as powerful and as permanent as you are. As if it has always been there and always will be. As if the best you can do is manage the war rather than end it. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy in exactly this position, organizing their lives around an opposing force, defining themselves by what they are against, measuring their progress by how well they are holding the darkness at bay, and the exhaustion of that is real. The weight of maintaining a defensive position against something you believe is as powerful as you are, that weight accumulates. It changes how you move through the world. It changes what you are able to build and love and imagine. Now consider what the Eastern tradition records Jesus saying in Persia. Darkness is not a force, it is an absence. You cannot fight it because there is nothing there to fight. The only response that accomplishes anything is not warfare. It is the introduction of light. I am not asking you to accept this as theology. I am not asking you to make any religious commitment whatsoever. I am asking you to notice what happens in your body when you consider the possibility that the thing you have been fighting, that person, that circumstance, that version of yourself, might not be an equal and opposing force at all, might not have the substance you have been granting it, might be, in the most precise philosophical sense, an absence rather than a presence. What would you do differently if you believed that, not as a naive optimist who denies that real harm exists in the world? The tradition is not saying that. Cartier was real. The suppression was real. The documents that did not survive were real losses, and the communities that were scattered suffered genuinely. Evil has consequences. The absence of light is cold and dark and dangerous. None of that is denied. But notice the difference between fighting darkness and introducing light. Notice the difference in posture, in energy expenditure, in what you build versus what you merely defend. This is what Reza Aslan of the University of California at Riverside, whose work Zealot, the Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, brought the historical Jesus to a mainstream audience, identifies as the most puzzling aspect of Jesus as a historical figure. Aslan's argument, developed with genuine scholarly rigor, is that Jesus was fundamentally a product of his political and social context. A Galilean peasant shaped by Roman occupation, Jewish messianic expectation, and the specific tensions of first-century Judean life. It is a compelling argument, and it accounts for much of what Jesus said and did. But it does not account for the non-dualism. It does not account for the instruction to love enemies, not tolerate them, not manage them, not strategically neutralize them, but love them in a political context where every other movement, without exception, organized itself around opposing an enemy. The Zealots opposed Rome with violence. The Pharisees opposed Rome with legal purity. The Essenes opposed Rome with separation. The Sadducees accommodated Rome with collaboration. Every available framework in first-century Judea was a framework of opposition, of cosmic or political dualism, of us and them, light and dark, chosen and unchosen. And then one man stood on a hillside and said, "Love your enemies." Aslan's contextual framework cannot fully explain where that instruction came from, because it did not come from the context. It came from somewhere outside the context, from a conversation that happened before the public ministry began, from 18 years of silence that were not, as it turns out, silent at all. Nicholas Thomas Wright, whose academic credentials place him among the foremost New Testament historians alive today, makes a related observation from a completely different direction. Wright argues in Jesus and the Victory of God that the radical originality of Jesus' ethical teaching is best understood not as the product of synthesis, not as Jesus borrowing from multiple traditions and combining them skillfully, but as the product of a genuinely new perception about the nature of reality itself. A perception that transcended every available category. What the Eastern tradition adds to Wright's analysis is geography and chronology. Where did that perception develop when, in what context, was the foundational philosophical question asked and answered? The evidence points east, to Persia, to the years the Gospels do not record, to a conversation with Zoroastrian masters that ended not with Jesus becoming one of them, but with Jesus questioning the premise that made them who they were. And here is the modern relevance that I want you to carry out of this video. We live in a world that is saturated with dualism. Not Zoroastrian cosmological dualism specifically, but the same basic structure. Two equal and opposing forces, two sides, two narratives, two versions of reality, each claiming the light for itself and assigning the darkness to the other. Political dualism, cultural dualism, ideological dualism. The social media algorithm is at its deepest structural level a dualism engine. It sorts the world into opposing camps and feeds each camp a steady diet of evidence that the other camp is the darkness. And the exhaustion that produces is not accidental. It is the logical consequence of organizing your perception around an equal and opposing force, of granting the darkness the dignity of your warfare. Now consider what it would mean practically, concretely, in the specific texture of your daily life, to operate from the premise that the darkness is an absence rather than a force. It does not mean passive acceptance of harm. It does not mean pretending that injustice is not real or that cruelty does not have consequences. It means something more demanding than either fighting or surrendering. It means the active, costly, disciplined introduction of light into spaces where light is absent. It means building rather than opposing, creating rather than dismantling, showing up rather than shutting out. This is what the communities that preserved the Eastern tradition about Jesus were doing in the face of Cartier's suppression. They were not organizing a counter-campaign. They were not building an opposition movement. They were misfiling documents in merchant warehouses and passing stories quietly from person to person across 3,000 miles of desert and mountain and sea. They introduced a small light into a very large darkness. And that light was still visible to Ibn Nadim in Baghdad in 987 of the Common Era. It was still visible to Aurel Stein in a sealed cave in Dunhuang in 1892. It was still visible to Helmut Küster at Harvard Divinity School in 1990. It is still visible now. Which brings us to the question that has been waiting at the center of this entire investigation since the moment we began. The question that Carsten Peter Thiede raised in 1990 when he told his colleagues that the manuscripts were not where everyone assumed they were. The question that the 18 years of silence in the gospel record poses every time someone reads Luke chapter 2 and then jumps to Luke chapter 3 without asking what happened in between. Not where did Jesus go during those lost years, but what did he come back with? What understanding did he carry back into Galilee that made everything he said afterward sound like nothing anyone had ever heard before? We have built the entire historical and philosophical case for an answer to that question. Now, in the final movement of this investigation, we bring it home. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this investigation, the beginning of the question itself. In 1990, Carsten Peter Thiede of the University of Paderborn stood in front of his colleagues and said something that no one put on the evening news. He said that manuscripts describing events from the life of Jesus were sitting in private collections in Iran and Afghanistan, uncatalogued, unread, waiting. At the time, most of his colleagues filed that observation away under the broad category of things that are probably true but inconvenient to pursue. The Cold War had just ended. Iran was politically inaccessible. Afghanistan was in the middle of a devastating civil conflict. The manuscripts, if they existed, were beyond reach. But Thiede was not making a political claim. He was making a scholarly observation. And the observation was this: the story of Jesus, as we have received it in the West, is not the complete story. It is one stream of a tradition that flowed in multiple directions from a single source. And some of those other streams, the ones that flowed east rather than west, the ones that passed through Persian territory and were shaped by Persian thought, and were nearly destroyed by a Persian priest with a crown of gold and fire. Those streams carried something that the Western tradition does not fully contain. We now know what that something is. It is the answer to the Zoroastrian question. Is the darkness equal to the light, Jesus, according to the Eastern tradition that Ibn Nadim glimpsed and Küster's scholarship illuminates, and the Dunhuang manuscript fragments corroborate? Jesus said no. Not as a simple negation, not as a reassuring platitude, as a philosophical position with radical practical implications. Darkness is not a force, it is an absence. You do not defeat it by fighting it. You end it by introducing light. And then he walked back west into Galilee and built an entire ethical system on that foundation. Love your enemies, not because they deserve it, because treating them as an equal opposing force concedes to them a substance they do not actually possess. You are the light of the world, not a warrior of the light itself. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, not because it is defended, but because it is visible, because it shines. Blessed are the meek, not the weak. The meek, the ones who have the power to fight and choose, instead to introduce light. The ones who understand that the force they are not deploying is precisely what makes them powerful. Every line of the Sermon on the Mount lands differently when you hear it through the lens of the Persian conversation that preceded it. Every instruction that seemed paradoxical, that struck the crowds on that hillside as something they had never heard before, that struck the religious authorities as dangerous, that struck the Roman administrators as baffling. Every one of those instructions is the logical, coherent application of a single philosophical premise developed in dialogue with Zoroastrian masters in the years the Gospels do not record. He did not go east to learn their premise. He went east and challenged it. And the system of thought he developed in that challenge became, when he carried it back west, the most radical ethical teaching in the history of the ancient world. Now, I want to bring this home to you personally, because we started this investigation with a question that was really two questions disguised as one. The surface question was, what happened during the 18 silent years? But the deeper question, the one that Thiede's observation points toward, the one that the silence in Luke between chapter 2 and chapter 3 has always been asking, is this what kind of person goes into 18 years of silence and comes out the other side with something genuinely new to say? Not something synthesized, not something borrowed and reassembled, something that fit no existing category, something that made the crowds say, as Matthew records in chapter 7, verse 29, that he taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. The scribes taught from tradition, from received wisdom, from the accumulated weight of what had already been said. Jesus taught from something else, from a perception about the nature of reality that he had tested and refined and sharpened in conversation with the most sophisticated theological tradition in the Persian world. From an answer to the deepest question that tradition could pose, from 18 years of silence that were in the most precise sense the opposite of silence. They were 18 years of the most consequential thinking in the ancient world. And here is what I want you to take from that. You have had your own silent years. Perhaps you are in them right now. The years when nothing visible is happening. The years when you are not yet doing the thing you sense you are building toward. The years when the people around you see only absence, only the silence of what you have not yet said, not yet built, not yet become. Those years are not wasted. The Eastern tradition tells us they are not wasted. The most important formation happens in the places that do not get recorded, in the conversations that do not make it into the official account, in the questions you wrestle with alone, or in the company of people who challenge your deepest premises before the world is ready to hear what you have worked out. The documents that survived Cartier's suppression survived not because they were powerful, but because they were small. A misfiled catalogue entry in a provincial warehouse, a quiet reference in a Baghdad bookseller's index, a fragment of Sogdian text in a sealed cave in the Chinese desert, small lights, introduced quietly into large darknesses. And 9 centuries after Cartier tried to extinguish them, Ibn Nadim could still see them. We started this investigation with a forensic manuscript specialist, telling his colleagues that the manuscripts were not where everyone assumed. We end it having followed the evidence to its conclusion. The manuscripts were never truly lost. They were misfiled, overlooked, preserved by accident in the wrong category of a bureaucratic inventory, waiting for someone to ask the question that everyone had somehow forgotten to ask. Is the darkness equal to the light? Jesus answered that question in Persia 2,000 years ago. The Eastern tradition preserved the answer. The silence in the Gospels was never an absence. It was always a light that had not yet been introduced. until now. If you have stayed with this investigation from the beginning, from Carsten Peter Thiede's overlooked observation in 1990, through the stone inscriptions of Cartier, through Ibn Nadim's single quiet sentence in a Baghdad catalogue, through the sealed caves of Dunhuang, through the philosophical conversation that the Gospels did not record, but the Eastern tradition preserved, then you already know something, that most people who have spent their entire lives inside the Christian tradition have never been told. Not because it was hidden from them deliberately, but because the question was never asked in the right place. The lost years were not lost. They were misfiled, and the document that preserved what happened in them was not suppressed by Rome. It was nearly destroyed by a Zoroastrian priest with fire on his crown, survived by bureaucratic accident, glimpsed by a Baghdad bookseller 9 centuries later, and has been waiting in plain sight in the footnotes of Kuster, in the catalogue entries of Ibn Nadim, in the Sogdian fragments of Dunhuang for someone to connect the threads. You just watched someone do that. And if that process, the careful, evidence-based, academically grounded pursuit of the history that official narratives leave in silence, if that process speaks to something in you, then this channel is where you belong. Every investigation we publish follows the same standard. Real scholars, real texts, real historical events. No fabricated sources, no invented institutions, no claims that cannot be traced to a verifiable document or a named academic with a published body of work. We do not deal in conspiracy, we deal in evidence. And we follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of whose institutional narrative it complicates. If that is the standard you have been looking for, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next investigation the moment it publishes. Because the next video goes somewhere that connects directly to what we uncovered today. We have established what Jesus said in Persia. The next investigation examines what happened to the community that preserved that saying, the Jewish-Persian diaspora communities that Cartier scattered and traces, where their tradition resurfaced 3 centuries later in a document that most scholars have read without understanding what they were actually holding. The thread does not end here, it goes deeper. And the community of people watching these investigations, the ones who refuse to settle for incomplete answers, who understand that the most important history is often the history that did not make it into the official record, that community is growing. Join it. The conversation in the comments of every video is where the investigation continues. Your question, your connection, your piece of the puzzle may be exactly what completes the picture for someone else watching. The silence has been broken. The light has been introduced. Come find out what it illuminates next. This content is produced for educational and historical reflection purposes, drawing on documented texts, scholarly research, and spiritual tradition. It represents one perspective in an ongoing conversation about faith and history, not a definitive claim.